I have had the unique experience in my professional life to be working in a space that's completely disconnected from any cultural edifice of Judaism or really organized religion whatsoever. It's a substance abuse treatment center, and aside from 12-step theory, so there's really no talk of any specificity of divinity or God or anything like that. So what I found in my professional career is that my usage or the utilization of the Hasidic teachings or Kabbalistic teachings, Chabad teachings are a particular aspect of it, but this can apply to really any teaching from the corpus of Hasidus, Kabbalah, Tanakh even, but it hasn't been a conscious effort on my part. That would be unethical and inappropriate. What I found that in my own clinical posture, that many of the teachings that I've learned have taken on a particular psychological notion, and I find it coming out in the day-to-day engagement with individuals. So in the spirit of the Balatanya and kind of throughout the transition of the thought of Chabad, there's a particular metaphorization of the teachings inherent in my work. So I'm not talking about ideas, but I feel that I'm actually, in a certain sense, unconsciously engaged in the ideas. And as the Alter Rebbe tells us in different places, there's a notion of this primordial metaphor, an irreducible metaphor that rests at the core of the teachings, which in a sense, I think, may traverse the question of universality or particularity with these teachings, because on the face of it, it seems to work with individuals from all directions and all spaces. So the idea that I want to focus on in particular, and again, this is a choice that I made out of many ideas, but I wanted to focus on the Middler Rebbe, the second Lubavitcher Rebbe that Jonathan Garb spoke so wonderfully about, and that Professor Lowenthal has written about, and Elliot spoke about. So the Middler Rebbe, and again, this is a limited knowledge of the major basis of Chabad teachings, but the Middler Rebbe seems to have engaged in a particular form of empathic engagement with his Hasidim. This is already seems to be a trend throughout the Admorim or the Rebbes of Lubavitch, but the Middler Rebbe, even according to the Rebbe Rashab and to the seventh Rebbe, seem to have a particular empathic posture. In contradistinction to the typical empathic posture, what Dan Zahavi would refer to as the inferential mode of intersubjectivity, where the provider or the therapist or the teacher or whoever it is that's in the power relation of the hierarchical relationship seems to try and infer from the posture of the other individual, primarily from their body, and then to infer from the body to the thought that I have with regards to that bodily posturing, and through that to engage in some sort of communication or bridge the gap or the void separating these individuals. Now, that empathic posturing or that inferential mode of empathy seems to struggle sometimes when the power structure is threatened. So the therapist very often is told not to disclose too much because you want to create the power necessary in the therapeutic relationship. Now, along the lines of therapeutic change, especially with Rogerian client-centered therapy, which was a stark, really, stance and defiance against the Freudian notion that the therapist was armed with a truth of interpretive ideas that could answer up or clarify the point of distress within the client, Carl Rogers basically dictated that the relationship itself is the closest thing to the curative process in therapy. The Middler Rebbe seemed to engage in this process where he would sit with his Hasidim and he wouldn't try and find similarities in his life vis-a-vis the life of the Hasid or the student or the client, but instead the Middler Rebbe would sit and find that experience within himself, not imposing himself on the other, not trying to pretend or act as if or ke'ilu understand in his own spiritual greatness what might be happening in this lowly individual, but rather very akin to what Kahot described as empathic immersion, where the therapist or the practitioner really enables themselves to be vulnerable and to find within themselves those same lacks and those same spaces of distortion, and they are relative in a certain sense. The Middler Rebbe would, in theory, see his areas of distortion as very different than the Chassid, but the Middler Rebbe writes in numerous introductions to his writings that the reason he's writing this is not because he wants to impart knowledge on the Hasidim, but because he knows what they feel. He understands the struggle of mundanity and trying to maintain a spiritual outlook in the world. He understands the Marashchora as a particular example. The Middle Rebbe understood what he described as black bile. Tali has written wonderfully about it in his book on the Middle Rebbe. But in theory, it seems to be, whether or not it was depression, it's certainly what Freud would describe as melancholia. And the Middle Rebbe focuses on that as a prerequisite to the understanding of the inner dimension of teachings. He describes it very powerfully in his tract on ecstasy, and he implies it even more, and he explicates it more in his tract on unity as well. But in a certain sense, the Middle Rebbe was an aspect of what Jung would describe as a wounded healer, that he was able to first and foremost understand the distortion of what it meant to be not a chassid or a rebbe, but to be a human being in part of the human condition, which is, in a certain sense, ontologically broken, a certain sense, ontologically irreparable. And the Mittler Rebbe used that, it seems, as a prerequisite to entering into the yichidut, or the individual one-on-one that he had with his Hasidim. And there's a wonderful story, which I actually have printed out, which will be part of the discussion, where the Mittler Rebbe was known to spend a lot of time in yichidut, or listening to his Hasidim complain. And really, I don't really know so much about the history of Yechidut, but it seems to be the introduction of therapeutic dialogue between a practitioner and a client, or a chassid and a rebbe, which is somewhat of a remarkable thing, especially in the modern day notion of rabbinics, where those two areas have to be kind of legally separated. But the Middle Rebbe would break at particular times, and his Hasidim asked him why he took such a long time, and the Rebbe would say, the Middle Rebbe would say that he doesn't give a piece of advice, he doesn't give eitzah until he can experience that same experience that the chassid is describing within himself. Now, that's not a question of acting as if, or finding within himself the capacity to join the narrative or therapeutically join the other, but it's really an act of finding the other within themselves. And what Chabad has done, and we've heard this so often throughout this conference, is that Chabad was in a certain sense a psychologization of Lurianic Kabbalah. And in a certain sense, we have explicit teachings which say that it's bringing the cosmos into the human being as opposed to putting the human being into the cosmos. And this psychological posture of the Middle Rebbe is not simply something that he intuited, but it seems to mirror image the ontological nature of what Kabbalah is coming to say. Now, the notion of hitklalut, or inter-inclusion, if you will, is a very simple question of how do we take these two polar opposites. In particular, we can say man and women, we can say what's called chesed, grace, and gvura, or severity or judgment. And the basic Lurianic system is based on the interactions and the interplay between the two of them. And the question is, how is that possible? How can that gap be bridged? And what the Mittler Rebbe and what Kabbalah and Hasidus describes is that each particular set in that set contains within itself the other. That the Gevura contains within itself an aspect of Chesed. The practitioner contains within himself already an aspect of the client, and the client contains within himself an aspect of the practitioner. And in practically engaging with clients from all sets of life, and engaging with people who are really at a particular point of suffering, what I have found, clinically speaking, is that embodying this and walking into the session and not basing the differences and the hierarchical power of what can I share with this person in terms of what do I have to hide from this person or withhold, but rather simply being an ear for that person to listen to, and acknowledging the fact that life is difficult or whatever particular situation is going on. Now, again, there's a relative difference between the problems that may arise between someone who's actively addicted to heroin and somebody who's struggling with their own notions of anxiety or what have you. But at the core of it, at the kernel of the human condition, there seems to be a shared experience which changes the entire direction of empathy from trying hard to artificially share towards trying hard to disclose a previously present similarity that you have with the other person. And it has changed my relationship with my clients. And what I found is that my otherness, my explicit otherness from the people that I deal with in terms of my religious observance and, who I am and where I'm from, more so as a New Yorker being in St. Louis than a Jewish individual in a particularly Christocentric state. But what I found is that barriers fall away very quickly when you acknowledge the basic awareness that we're human beings together. And the idea that I think, and this is from the Alter Rebbe, but I think that it captures this so powerfully is that I think it's in Perek Membeis 42 of the Tanya, where there's a pasuk in Yeshaya that says, Beis Yaakov asher pada es Avraham, the house of Jacob who has redeemed Avraham. So there's a very simple chronological question that the commentators ask, which is that Yaakov came after Avraham, so how is it possible that he redeemed him? Now, according to Kabbalistic imagery and symbology, so Avraham represents grace or chesed, he represents the right pillar, which is the loving kindness of divinity, and Yaakov represents this middle pillar, this synthesis between two disparate parts, where it's mercy or rachamim, or possibly a good word to describe empathic compassion. And the Baal HaTanya says that if you want to redeem ahava, if you want to redeem or find fallen love, or love that's no longer there, or disconnection, or machloket, or anger, or ka'as, that's in place of love, the best way to do that is through rachmanut, or recognizing, in a sense, empathically, the shared humanity of the person next to you. And I see it in the Mittler Rebbe, and I'm sure it's in the other Rebbeim as well, but what I found is that it has changed my professional outlook. And this is one specific example, but I have many of teachings that I can directly see how they kind of filter out into my daily practice. Thank you.